So when I was 12, I went to the grocery store with my mother and I wanted a candy bar. So I asked her if I could get one, and when she said no, well, what did I do? I took the candy bar and I put it in my pocket and went home and ate it for later. But I was caught the next day and I got in trouble for it. Well, you're probably asking, Seth, why are you saying this? Why are you telling me? Well, the reason why is because it's a lie. It never happened. How many times have you wondered if somebody has lied to you? Probably more times than you can count, unfortunately. But, I mean, lying's something that everybody does, whether intentionally or not. And with understanding how the human body reacts, both physically and emotionally, you can pick up on deceptive indicators and tell if somebody's actually telling you the truth when necessary. The first part I want to demonstrate and talk about is something called behavioral pauses. I also want to talk about delays and memory recall and response time of being guarded. With pauses and delays, a good example of this is if I ask you, what did you do on this day 5 years ago? You're probably not going to have an immediate answer, if at all. So you're going to have to stop and think about it and then eventually answer the question. But if I ask you, on this day 5 years ago, did you rob a bank? Well, your immediate response should be, no, of course not. I've never robbed a bank. If they have to stop and think about that, you may want some different friends. With memory recall, this is really interesting because somebody being truthful can tell a story from beginning to end, step by step, with significant detail. Granted, they might miss some details here and there out, but that's just part of memory recall with the human body. However, somebody lying can tell a story from beginning to end with enough truth, you should say, that would make you believe the story. However, if you ask them to tell the story backwards from ending to begin, it's going to be much harder for the person lying to accurately tell the same story they did from beginning to end. With response time, this kind of ties in with pauses and delays. If you ask somebody a question and they immediately respond to you, typically that's a good thing because it's going to say that they don't have anything to hide. They don't have to stop and think what they're going to say first. But this can be situational. They could be doing it so they don't offend you. They could still be lying. Say, for instance, if you ask your significant other, have you been cheating on me? Immediately they're probably going to say no right away, even if they have been, just to, kind of cover their own mistakes. But so you got to really pay attention to that one. With being guarded, there's a couple things I can think about where you can, you're folding your arms, or you're leaning back even. You're trying to put some distance between themselves and you. That'd be one form of guarding, and mainly that's because they're being defensive. That they're trying to shield themselves. The next thing I want to talk about is verbal and nonverbal disconnect. This also, I also want to talk about clearing the throat. Head nodding, which can be a big one too, and the use of wordplay, which is very interesting, I think. Clearing the throat or swallowing isn't really a big deal if they do it after they answer the question, but if they do it constantly before they answer a question, then that is a red flag for a deceitful indicator. And another one would be, I'm trying to think here, like law enforcement would definitely pinpoint that one more than most people, especially when they're doing interrogations. But that's a whole different situation because you could just simply be nervous or have anxiety, which anxiety does tie in with being deceitful, but there is an extent. Shaking your head no when you say yes could be another indicator. This is where the verbal and nonverbal disconnect comes in. What you're saying doesn't match up with what you're showing. And there's somebody I want to talk about. I might have to refer to my notes, unfortunately, for this. But there was a psychology professor named James Pennebaker at the University of Texas at Austin. And between him and his associates, they developed a computer software which was called Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, or LIWC for short. Now, this computer software what it did was it analyzes written content, and it can, with a certain degree of accuracy, predict if somebody's lying through what they write. Pennebaker says deception appears to carry three primary written markers. The first one is fewer first-person pronouns. Now, with this, people who are lying, they're going to use fewer first-person pronouns because they want to avoid ownership. You know, they want to distance themselves from what they're saying, and they also want to avoid taking responsibility for their behavior. The second one is more negative emotion words, which people telling the truth and people lying are both going to use negative emotion words. It's just with people lying, they're generally going to use more of these. And some include hate, worthless, or sad. You know, I hate that person, or that person's worthless, or it's sad that that person did that to that young woman. Liars are, they typically have more anxiety than someone telling the truth, and they often feel guilty too, which is why they'll use more of these negative words. The last one is fewer exclusionary words, which include stuff like except, but, or nor. And these kind of words, these exclusionary words, they distinguish from what the person did to what they didn't do. And liars will use less of these because it gets really complex, and people who are lying have an issue with complexity, you know, keeping everything together. You know, you tell one lie, well, then you got to tell another to cover up that lie, and then another lie to cover up those lies, and it just gets too complex and breaks down, and eventually you're caught. So that's what happens. The LIWC software, it was published, and through multiple case studies, it was found that it was more effective at identifying deceptive or truthful writing samples than human judges. The software had an accuracy rate of 67% as opposed to 52% from the human judges, which is still a pretty high number. You know, 52%, you know, 1 out of every 2 people, you know, you can figure out if they're lying or not. But I would rather have that almost 70% from the software. The last things I want to talk about are physical gestures or activities, such as like hand movement, you know, and placement, grooming, hiding the eyes and the mouth, and how you're sitting, your posture, and also eye movement, which is kind of iffy, but we'll get to that. Hand-to-face activity can involve, you know, biting of the lips or licking the lips constantly. You can also pull on the lips or pull on the ear, which interesting thing to look up sometime is with presidential candidate debates or even presidential speeches. Oftentimes when, you know, the news or, you know, journalists and stuff, they'll ask them questions, they'll tug on their ear, and typically that's a deceptive indicator, so they're probably not saying the whole truth. I wouldn't say they're lying completely, but they're probably hiding some stuff from you. What also works with this is wringing of the hands constantly. This is due to anxiety, same way with the touching of the lips and the ears. What happens when you have a spike in anxiety is the blood flow from your extremities, your arms, your hands, your feet, and your face and ears, they'll drain. So they'll feel a little clammy and itchy, and therefore, without you knowing, you're actually doing these movements. Hiding the eyes or the mouth is another deceptive indicator. Typically, it's because they don't want to see how you respond to what they said. You know, they just can't. They can't stand it. So they'll cover their mouth, or they'll cover their eyes when they're talking to you, or maybe they'll just look away. You know, completely. Another big one is with the grooming. Depending on, you know, you can't really see my arms of the chair here, but if they're constantly rubbing this, or, you know, they're rubbing their arms, or, you know, with guys with ties, they'll constantly adjust it. Females, they'll often take their hair and put it behind their ears. You have to do it quite often, not just one time, because, I mean, long hair is kind of annoying, and if it gets in the way, you want to move it, right? But fidgeting, you know, is really a big deceptive indicator that somebody's not being completely truthful. The last one is eye contact. This one hasn't been really proven to be an effective deceptive indicator, so take it with a grain of salt. The biggest ones would be uncomfortable eye contact. If they're like staring at you and not blinking, or blinking maybe a couple times a minute. A fun fact is the average human blinks 15 to 20 times a minute, so you could kind of base it off that if you're really paying attention. Or it could be the other side of that, excessive blinking. If they're blinking 40, 50 times a minute, generally that's because of anxiety. Some people say, if they look a certain way, that they're lying, but again, that hasn't really been proven. So just to review the steps here, in order to tell if somebody's lying, to look out for deceptive indicators, you want to see how fast they're responding, what they're saying is correct and consistent. Are they telling the same story over and over again with the same details, or is it constantly changing? You want to know if they're clearing their throat. How are they responding verbally and non-verbally? Is stuff not matching up? Are they constantly fidgeting around? Are they kind of being defensive and guarding? Just keep an eye on everything that's going on when you're talking to somebody, and use all of these indicators together to be able to tell to an extent if somebody is lying or not. You could go your entire day not even realize you've lied. For example, with if you have kids, with my kids, if they say, "Can I have some candy?" For instance, I'd be like, "No, we don't have candy," even if I do have some up there in the cupboard. I just say it to drop the subject and move on about my day. It's a white lie, something small, something not significant, but it's still a lie. Taking the information that I gave you today about the deceptive indicators will be able to help you spot a lie before it becomes too serious and actually impactful in your life. Just remember that not all the indicators mean that they're lying. You have to bunch them together, and it's also situational on the person, on the individual themselves. A cultural background, for example, would be something to pay attention to. Because, for instance, nodding your head yes or no doesn't actually mean yes or no in some cultures. So you just got to pay attention to that too. Thank you.